The forests of northern Wisconsin have a dark reputation. People enter, but they don't always come out. Some stories are forgotten, while others become impossible to ignore. In 2005, a young hiker got lost in the dense shadows of these woods. When he was found days later, he was disoriented, with no memory of where he'd been, and with a story no one would dare believe. Today, we'll explore the most disturbing mysteries of these woods: unexplained disappearances, strange sightings, and what might truly be lurking between the trees. But before we begin, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss one of our chilling videos. Stay until the end, if you dare. Case 1. The solitary disappearance. Jack Thompson was not the type of man to get lost. At 48 years old, he had spent much of his life hunting, fishing, and exploring the vast forests of northern Wisconsin. To him, the tall trees and cold winds were not threats, but allies in a lifestyle he embraced with pride. As the hunting season was about to end, Jack decided to make the most of one last day with friends, hunting in a remote area he knew like the back of his hand. It was a gray morning when the group parked their trucks at a barely marked entry point. The dry leaves crackled under their boots as they walked along the trail, and the occasional sound of crows echoed in the air. Jack, carrying his rifle and a light backpack, led the way with confidence. He always made a point of exploring a bit deeper into the forest than the others, believing the best targets were beyond the usual trails. Around noon, the group scattered to cover more ground. Jack spotted fresh tracks in the snow, the unmistakable mark of a large deer. "They'll follow this way. They'll meet you at the rendezvous point at dusk," he told his companions over the radio before disappearing into the trees. The disappearance. Jack followed the tracks with absolute focus. He moved with the precision of someone who knew every sound of the forest, interpreting the snap of branches and subtle signs of movement as clues in a game he had played countless times. With each step, the footprints in the snow became clearer, but something began to unsettle him. The silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No sounds of birds or wind rustling through the treetops. Only the sound of his own boots sinking into the snow. He paused for a moment, looking around. It was strange, but Jack was not the type to get scared. "I'm almost there. I think the deer is close," he murmured into the radio, keeping his tone calm. His friend's response came full of interference, but he could make out the voice. "Stay alert. We're close to the meeting point." Further ahead, Jack saw something that appeared to be a cleared trail. It was a small corridor between the trees, as if someone or something had passed through, creating a path. He hesitated, but curiosity won. He followed the trail with steady steps, rifle ready. Suddenly, Jack stopped. There were human footprints in the snow, but they were strange. The steps were unevenly spaced, as if whoever had made them was limping or running from something. He looked around, his breathing becoming heavier. He brought the radio to his ear and said, "Are you seeing this? Someone's here." Before he could hear a response, a muffled sound came from somewhere ahead. It sounded like a branch snapping, but there was something different about it, almost as if it echoed from beneath the ground. He took a step forward, the radio crackling with static, and then everything went silent. When Jack's friends arrived at the meeting point at dusk, he was not there. The search. Jack's absence at the meeting point didn't immediately alarm the group. He was known to lose track of time when following promising tracks. However, as darkness began to envelop the forest, His friends decided to look for him. The group returned to the spot where they had split up, using flashlights to illuminate the trail. The fresh snow captured the tracks well, and Jack's were easy to identify. They quickly followed his footprints, but after a few minutes, they noticed something strange. The tracks disappeared abruptly. "What's this?" muttered Paul, the group's informal leader. He illuminated the area around him with his flashlight. Jack's footprints simply stopped, as if he had been pulled into the sky or sucked into the ground. The silence of the forest became oppressive, and the air felt colder. They found other signs. Jack's backpack resting against a tree, his rifle perfectly leaned against the trunk. Both were in good condition, with no signs of struggle or animal attack. But why would he have left everything behind? Paul picked up Jack's radio, which was next to the backpack. The last recorded message was a low crackling, interspersed with indecipherable words. "There's footsteps," was all they could understand. That night, the group notified local authorities. A search team was assembled the next morning, consisting of police, search dogs, and volunteers. For days, they scoured every corner of the area but found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, no body. It was as if Jack had been erased from existence. As the official search continued, locals began sharing stories that added a new layer of unease. An old hunter, known only as Walter, told Jack's friends about other disappearances in the same area. "They call that part of the forest the shadow. People go in, they don't come back. And if they do, they're not the same person." Walter's accounts included disturbing details. Footsteps that followed people in the forest, human-like shadows that appeared between the trees, and a low hum that some described as a collective whisper. No matter how hard Jack's friends tried to find answers, everything seemed to lead to more questions. Paul, disturbed, visited the spot where Jack's tracks had ended. He swore he heard something that night, a faint sound, almost like muffled laughter, coming from deep within the dark forest. After weeks of tireless searching, the case of Jack Thompson was officially closed. Local authorities claimed that while there was evidence he had disappeared, there were no signs of struggle, animal attacks, or any other indication of a crime. The verdict was as simple as possible. Jack Thompson simply vanished. However, what remained after the investigation were the words of Walter, the old hunter. "The shadow doesn't let anyone go." This saying became a common whisper among the inhabitants of the small town nearby. No one knew exactly what Walter meant, but the stories of the old local hunters began to receive more attention. Some believed Jack had been the victim of an unexpected wild animal attack, although no clear signs of injuries were found. Others pointed to what many called the door, a dark allegory for the area where he disappeared. It was said that this part of the forest was a place where time and space seemed to distort. They claimed that some of the trees there were alive in a strange way, whispering to those willing to listen. But there was one theory that began to gain more strength. Jack had not been taken by an animal or something natural. He had been chosen like so many victims before him. The forest, the old northern Wisconsin forest, didn't allow all visitors to leave unscathed. Some of the older hunters spoke of a pact, something that had existed since the first settlers. The forest, with its tall, dense trees, was alive in a way no one understood. And when it wanted something, it took what it desired. Paul, still shaken by his friend's disappearance, tried to come to terms with this idea. He returned to the forest a few weeks later, hoping to find answers that no one else seemed willing to seek. But in his heart, something told him that Jack hadn't disappeared. He had been taken. In the following months, Paul felt a persistent sense of being watched. In every tree, on every trail, he felt as if something was observing him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And though he tried to ignore it, a part of him knew that the forest had not finished with Jack. It was simply waiting to see him again. Case 2: The Last Contact. Emily, Jason, and Brian were three inseparable friends, always on the lookout for new adventures. They were college students with a passion for exploring unexplored places and dark stories that made their nights more exciting. As the semester was about to end, they decided that it would be the perfect time for a trip to the Chequamegon Forest, a remote area in northern Wisconsin known for its mysterious legends. The camp was set up early in the afternoon, in an isolated clearing surrounded by tall trees that created a sense of seriousness and protection. The weather was perfect for a peaceful stay, but soon tension began to take over them. The place seemed too quiet, with none of the usual sounds of the local wildlife. Jason was the first to voice his unease. "It's strange here, right? We haven't heard a single animal sound. I thought the forest would be more alive." But Emily, always the most optimistic, replied with a smile. "It must be the exhaustion. After so much time at college, nature just seems quieter. Let's just enjoy the moment." As the sun began to set, the group gathered around the campfire. They told scary stories, laughed, and planned what they would do the next day. Everything seemed normal until, as the night went on, something began to change. At 10 p.m., Emily sent a message to her sister, saying, "We're hearing strange things at night. I think we're being watched." She sent the message quickly, as if trying to downplay the gravity of the situation. But this would be the last contact anyone would have with the three friends. After that message, the silence was broken by a distant scream. Brian, the bravest of the group, was the first to get up and search for the source of the sound. The tension hung in the air, and fear seemed to grow. The discovery. As Brian moved away from the campfire, a strange sensation took hold of Emily and Jason. The scream they had heard echoed in their minds, but no one knew what caused it. Was it an animal, or something more supernatural? "Brian, are you there?" Emily shouted, trying to stay calm, but her voice faltered, cut off by the intensity of fear. The sounds of the night seemed to have grown thicker, as if the forest was reacting to their presence. Jason, visibly tense, grabbed a flashlight and began walking toward the area where Brian had disappeared. "This isn't normal, Emily," Jason said, the light from his flashlight dancing in his trembling hand. "He would never scream like that if it were just an animal." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Jason was right, but something inside her told her to go back to the tent and stay as quiet as possible. Still, she felt guilty for hesitating. They couldn't just leave Brian alone, especially in a place like this. As they walked down the narrow trail, the sound of dry leaves crunching under their feet was deafening. When they reached the spot where Brian had gone off, they stopped abruptly. There was something strange in the air. The temperature seemed to have dropped drastically. Amid the darkness of the night, a silhouette could be seen between the trees, a human shape, but it was different. "Brian?" Emily called, her voice trembling, but there was no answer. Jason, with the instinct to protect his friend, moved toward the shadow, but as he took a step, he froze. What he saw was not Brian. It was a hunched figure, with arms disproportionately long, its hands almost touching the ground. Its eyes glowed with a threatening red hue, as if hell itself was reflected in them. Jason instinctively backed away, but as he did, It was as if the forest began to swallow them. The trees seemed to move, closing off their path. Fear overtook them both, and the fight for survival became real. Emily turned to run, but something pulled her back, an invisible force that made her fall to the ground. Jason's flashlight fell, and everything around them went dark. She felt a weight on her chest and heard a deep whisper, a voice that was not human. "Leave while you still can." The silent end. What happened next was a blur, a sequence of panic flashes and a desperate fight for survival. Emily, still on the ground, felt an increasing pressure on her chest, as if something was trying to tear her soul apart. The air around her was saturated with a hum that seemed to emanate from the trees, a distant but omnipresent sound, as if the forest itself had a voice. Jason, with the flashlight fallen beside him, grabbed Emily and dragged her away. "We have to get out of here. Quickly," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. They ran toward the clearing where they had set up camp, but something was stopping them from seeing clearly. The forest seemed to close in on them. The trees were no longer just trees. They seemed to move, swaying with a supernatural force, as if they were alive. When they reached the clearing, the campfire was out, the smoke still rising in thin threads to the sky. The silence was absolute, heavy. There was no sign of Brian. Emily's radio, which she still carried, was silent, the battery already drained. It was as if everything around them had stopped existing. "What is this? What's happening?" Emily whispered, still panicking, trying to process the chaos they had experienced. Jason didn't answer, his expression empty. He looked at the forest, as if seeing something she couldn't see. Then he spoke quietly, "He's not coming back. None of us are leaving here. He chose us." Before Emily could understand, a shadow formed beside her. A tall figure, with the same red eyes she had seen earlier, rose before them, so close that she could feel the hot breath exhaling from it. "It's too late to run," the figure whispered, its voice reverberating inside her mind. Fear overtook Emily like never before. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt paralyzed, unable to react. The being before her extended its hand, and a searing pain filled her body, as if her energy was being drained. Jason looked at her, his eyes full of desperation, but he, too, seemed unable to move. The wind from the forest began to intensify, and the screams of Emily and Jason blended with the sound of the vegetation violently rustling around them. In an instant, everything went dark. The search for them lasted for weeks. The police and volunteers returned to the forest, but, as with Jack's disappearance, no trace was found. The footprints of Emily, Jason, and Brian vanished the same way, without explanation. Local residents whispered about the shadows that inhabited the forest, about the ancient presence that lived there, waiting for lost souls. But more than that, some theories began to spread. One of the most popular suggested that the forest wasn't just a place of mystery but a sort of portal to another dimension, where the souls of those who get lost there are trapped in an eternal cycle, doomed to live out what remained of their humanity. Others spoke of an ancient entity that ruled the area, feeding on fear and vital energy, drawing those who ventured too far. And an even more disturbing theory said that those who disappeared were never really dead but became part of the forest itself, as if the spirit of the forest took them over, recreating them to become new guardians of the land. And you? What do you think happened to Emily, Jason, and Brian? What do you believe the shadows in the forest really are? Leave your theory in the comments. Who knows? Your perspective might change everything. Case 3. The Unexplained Survivor. Chapter 1: The Last Train. The night was cold and silent. The forest around Mark seemed to swallow the sound of anything that moved. He was sitting alone in a train car, which seemed like it would never reach its destination. The train traveled along rusty tracks, heading toward a remote town in the heart of northern Wisconsin. It was a journey he never would have made, but for some inexplicable reason, he found himself aboard. Mark looked out the window and saw only dense darkness. The view outside seemed swallowed by the forest, as though the train was moving away from everything he knew. The conductor, who should have been at the front of the locomotive, was absent. In fact, there was something strange about this train. The sound of its movement seemed muffled, making the train feel almost like an entity walking through the darkness, detached from the outside world. Not knowing what to do, Mark stood up and walked through the cars, trying to find anyone, who could explain what was going on. The train was completely empty. It moved quickly through the darkness, but he didn't feel the usual acceleration or vibration that a train would typically give. He touched one of the doors, but it was locked. There was no escape. Then, suddenly, a deep voice echoed throughout the cabin, without a visible source. "You shouldn't be here, Mark." The voice seemed to come from all directions at once, with an echo that resonated in Mark's mind. He looked around, confused, but saw no one. It was as though the train itself were a living entity, a place where time and space no longer applied. The voice continued, "This is the train of forgetfulness. Those who enter never leave." Mark froze, tension building in his chest. He moved away from the window and tried to make sense of what was happening. The words from the voice tormented him, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit and wait. He reached into his jacket pocket, searching for his phone, but there was no signal. It was as though the train was beyond the reach of the world. With an increasing sense of panic, Mark went to the end of the car, where he found a door. When he opened it, he found what seemed to be a control room. But what terrified him even more was the screen on the wall, which displayed a looping video. In the video, he saw an image of a train, exactly like the one he was traveling in, and heard muffled screams. The image of the train disappeared for a moment, leaving only darkness. Then, the screen revealed something even more disturbing. Mark, sitting in the very cabin where he was. The reflection on the screen wasn't just a technical error. It was as if he were being watched, as though someone or something was controlling his journey. "You can't escape." The voice spoke again, now closer, almost like a whisper in his ear. "It's been a long time since you entered." He looked back and saw a figure in the shadows, a silhouette, but it vanished before he could identify what or who it was. Panic overtook Mark. He ran back to the car, but as he passed by the window, he saw something even more frightening. The trees, the tracks, the landscape, everything looked the same, as if the train were trapped in an endless cycle. He didn't know where it was heading, but he knew he couldn't stop moving. Mark screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the vast, silent forest surrounding him. He was trapped, and the only thing accompanying him was the constant sound of the train. The voice spoke again, this time more calmly, as if it were watching Mark's despair with pleasure. "What you see is not real. This is a place where the lost come. You are the last. What will you do?" As the voice dissipated, Mark sat, defeated, on the wooden bench of the car. He no longer had the strength to keep fighting, but he knew that the true battle was yet to come. Chapter 2: The Unexplained Survivor. Mark shivered when he woke up. The sound of the train moving over the tracks was strange, as if the locomotive was slowly decelerating. He didn't know how much time had passed, but everything around him seemed even more distorted, more unreal. The cold light of the cabin flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The figures around him were unreal, as if the train itself were made of fragments of memory. He stood up, feeling a knot in his stomach. Something was terribly wrong. The voice that echoed in his mind, always soft but filled with authority, had said something crucial. The test begins now. Mark knew he had to make a decision, but he was lost, unsure of where to go. With the train now moving slower, he approached the door. It was locked again. Desperate, he looked out the window. The Wisconsin forest surrounding him seemed alive. The trees, once still and silent, now appeared to move, leaning toward the train as if they were watching him. Mark swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. The train was no longer moving naturally. It seemed trapped in a loop, in a reality with no escape. Suddenly, he heard a sound coming from behind. A door opened, but when he turned, no one was there. In place of the door, a screen appeared on the wall of the car. Mark approached and saw his own reflection, but the image on the screen was distorted. He was standing in the same car, but one version of him seemed to be moving away, dissolving, as if he were about to be left behind. The screen flickered to an image of a forest, and suddenly Mark saw what appeared to be a figure standing among the trees. He recognized the woman, the same one he had seen before, with empty eyes and an enigmatic smile. She was watching him from a distance, as if she knew something he didn't. The train began to speed up again, and the air grew heavy. Mark looked at the windows around him and saw, in the distance, the silhouette of a figure moving quickly through the forest. He felt a wave of panic. What was that? An animal? Or something else? Fear took hold of his mind, but he couldn't stop now. The voice returned, clearer than ever. You need to decide, Mark. The test continues. Will you be the survivor or just another lost soul? As the pressure mounted, Mark felt like he was sinking into a nightmare. He could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. The cabin began to spin, as if it were falling into a vortex. The woman on the screen smiled again, but her smile turned into something distorted, as if she were being pulled out of her own existence. It was as if reality itself was dissolving around him. The train abruptly slowed down, and for a moment, everything was silent. Mark looked outside. The horizon was empty. What had once been a dense forest was now replaced by a vast and desolate field, with twisted, lifeless trees. The train tracks seemed to disappear into nothing, a path that led nowhere. It was then that Mark realized he was never going anywhere. The train, the forests, the distortions, everything was a metaphor for the lost, souls that had never found the way out. He wasn't just trapped on the train. He was trapped in his own mind, in his own fear. And the woman, perhaps, was a reflection of his own internal struggle. He needed to face what was happening, the truth behind the test. With no more choices left, Mark approached the window and looked out into the emptiness. Fear took over him, but at the same time, a sense of freedom washed over him. He didn't know how, but he finally understood. He needed to leave the fear behind, not fight it, but accept it. The train slowed down once more, and the screen flashed to one last image. Mark leaving the train, walking into the darkness. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, the train had vanished. The forest was empty. There were no more shadows or distortions, just the silent night of Wisconsin. Mark was alone, but there was no more fear. He was the survivor. What happened to Mark? Some believe he was confronted with his own inner demons and, by deciding to accept the fear and move forward, he finally escaped the prison the train represented. Others suggest that the train was a manifestation of the lost souls in the forest, an endless cycle of repetition. What do you think? Did Mark truly escape, or is he trapped in an eternal cycle of hallucination? Leave your theories in the comments below. What happened to the train and why did it appear to Mark?